Welcome to the Hyper Guy Motivational Podcast. I'm so lucky today because I have two wonderful people on. I have a co-host, Miss Elon Carter. She is a co-host of Tempting Conversations, and I had her on a previous podcast. She has an amazing story, so you can listen to her on other podcasts. But she's joining us today because is a great intellectual, and I love having her on my show. And Carlos Becerra is my guest today. He is the CEO and founder of Becerra Educational Consulting. He establishes educational curriculum and he has a tutoring company. He provides personalized tutoring dedicated to helping students succeed. He teaches leadership. He's in educational tech and curriculum design. He mentors, tutors, and prepares leaders how to be leaders and be successful academically. And is there anything else, Carlos? I know there's a lot more. You have a BA from the University of Chicago, and you're a doctoral candidate at USC. I can keep going on, my friend.
Martin, I appreciate you having me on here, and Elon, it's so great to get the opportunity to sort of connect with both of you and just talk through. I think that's plenty for that.
We're excited because this is information that we don't know that we need help with, especially if you have kids, right? Which I do. I have one that I've got to get there. So I wish I would have met you years ago, but I'm happy to have you now.
It's great to be here. My two are 2 and 4, so we have some time before I get to switch seats.
Yeah. And Carlos, I was talking with you earlier, and one of the things that you brought up, what I really, really like that you're doing now is it's not just you started out with teenagers, and now you're doing it preparing people for college after they completed high school. But now you're also doing adults and non-traditional learners because you have so many people now that want to go back to school, and so you kind of guide them through that process, all the barriers and things to getting into college and being new learners. What are those kind of barriers? So I really think that's just amazing that there's someone that's doing that in this space.
It definitely it's interesting because once you start looking at test preparation and admissions as more than just beating the test or just gaming the system, and you start to really focus on the educational component, it makes sense to start earlier, right? You don't want to just say, hey, you're 16, you need to take this test by 17, let me teach you how to beat it, because the educational value long term is very limited, right? And what you're teaching that student is it's just not the type of skills that you'll need later in life. So we make a significant effort to try to start with our students earlier, and we teach kids as early as 10 and 11, and work with all the way up through adults, graduate school, but focusing on teaching them the material, talking about the concepts, understanding the soft skills that are necessary to succeed on exams, but in other situations as well, as opposed to just gaming the system. Because I feel like that's what you hear in the news and the bad rep that test prep gets. And yes, some people do that, but that's just not something we do within sort of our boutique educational ecosystem.
And Carlos, where were you born and raised? What got you into this, I guess?
Wow. So I think so I come from a family of educators. Both my parents were professors, and actually grandparents and great grandparents. I have a pretty strong teacher background. I was born in Amarillo, Texas. My mom was getting her doctorate at UT Austin, and my dad was teaching at a nearby college. But both my parents are from Colombia, and I actually grew up. Half of my childhood was in Bogota and Cartagena in Colombia, and coming, here, my parents' education was everything. And so I was born in Texas. We made our way to Youngstown, Ohio, for my dad to teach for the Youngstown Penguins, and which is where my sister was born and where most of our childhood was spent before I came to Chicago.
And what was school like for you growing up?
It was interesting. So initially, when I remember still for like elementary school, the challenge of being bilingual, and the sort of school, and then when I would go home, it would be sort of round 2. My mom was very adamant about making sure that every night I read in Spanish, and that I was practicing, writing and et cetera. And since both of my parents were Spanish professors, that was a fairly intense upbringing. But I'm so grateful for it now because it allows me to really reach across different schooling systems. And so school was challenging from that capacity, and also, fitting in when you're sort of half of the time not at home, and with my family in Colombia was a little bit challenging, but it was great. It was really a fun childhood, very suburban childhood on that end.
And what was it like for you in terms of, was school fun for you? I mean, did you enjoy school? Was it a struggle for you? Did you know what you wanted to do later when you grew up?
So okay, so I think from a fun capacity, yes. I mean, I that was a geek. I mean, and that went from not only the academic sense, I also really love music. So that was something that was a big part of my life throughout middle school and high school. And so those two components, but I also really love sports. So I had sort of my friendships and my education sort of centered around the activities that I was able to do. So it was a pretty jam-packed schedule, but I was able to pursue a lot of it simply because geographically it made sense, right? Sometimes when you're doing travel sports or you're doing other things, you have to choose. And I was really fortunate not to have to choose between these different passions. So I had a very like balanced and fun childhood. So I loved school, but I also got to balance it out with other extracurriculars.
What made you get into teaching, I guess?
So part of my childhood was spent in my parents' classrooms. So I was some of the chores that I had would be, hey, I need you to add these numbers because this is the scores for a final exam. So can you add all these numbers and make this spreadsheet for me, or et cetera, right? Which I guess was helpful for my mathematical skills, but also sort of exposed me to the classroom and to sort of the process of learning the different steps during that. So that was fascinating. And then as I got older, I did a lot of tutoring and helping my peers, and I would usually be studying in Colombia. I was usually a grade or two ahead. So by the time I would come back and go to school here in the States, a lot of times I've seen this material, but I really enjoyed teaching my friends and helping them out as well. So teaching was something that was just a way for me to connect with my peers. And yeah, and as I got older and went to college, it was something that continued to be a big part of my life. I started tutoring when I came to Chicago as a way to sort of support sort of my day-to-day expenses in college and try to sort of take that burden off of my parents. And that's kind of where BEC started. And as soon as I graduated, I was like, why not? Why not?
I was gonna say, I think your parents, I give them kudos for doing that, because when you first said, I love like teaching, and this is something I want to do, I like school. And I was like, that's interesting. You don't hear young people say that, right? As a young person. But then when you said your parents had you in the classes and marking the papers and helping them, that is something as a child, when your parents put you in that position, I think probably helped a lot, because it made you feel a part of them and important, and give you a job. And you don't realize what an impact when parents do small things like that at that age. It makes you feel you had some fulfillment. So maybe you go, oh, hey, you think that was one of the reasons why you grasped and gravitated to wanting to keep doing that, because of the situation that they put you in, versus if you didn't have parents who were in that position, you had teachers that you didn't deal with. And I think that's one of the reasons what's hard for kids. I know for my son, because my son came from England, even though English is his first language, British English, the vocabulary is different. So even though he was a young guy, the teachers were like, he's not smart, he doesn't know what he's doing. But I'm like, the vocabulary is totally different, and then you got this brown kid saying he was in England. So I was just saying some of the things were parallel, but because he had teachers that weren't supportive, I think you having parents who are professors, it was a blessing that you probably realize now that brought
Yeah.
you to where you are?
Definitely, definitely. And I think that you're right. As a parent, that sort of what you do early on has such an impact on not even like the path, but also just your frame of reference, right? I think that just understanding that education could be more than just teaching only in a classroom, right? I think that that was the valuable part. Like my dad also is an author, right? So understanding, hey, the stuff that you're teaching, the students that you're meeting, uh, can be, you can reach them in so many different manners, right? And I think that that exposure then allows us to sort of recreate, right? I really love business. That's something that was very interesting to me. And the ability to be able to take education and business and combine it probably, yeah, goes back to those days of sitting in the classroom. And probably, I don't know how many people will understand this reference, but the purple ink and like the non-collating printers, right, where you actually had to sit and order all the pages, and back in the day, right, that type of those type of simple
Yeah.
tasks, but that quality time as well, right,
Right.
that allows you to grow on that end. So yeah, 100.
It gives you a broader perspective too. Like, my son, he went to private school, always went to private schools, and he loves music. And my husband wanted him to do sports. My husband played sports at Yale. He was really good at sports, but my son was a little guy, right? So I knew early on that wasn't his thing. And so I started putting him and other things, because I said, look, if we lay the foundation now, then he'll have different things to choose from. Instead of, most parents get caught up in, and it's more of, I realize now as an adult, as a parent, an older parent, that our ego is a lot of what we want our kids to be. So it was trying to pull my husband out of, he's just not that great at sports, for him to get that in his head, because that's what he was taught, right? And I grew up in the music industry. So I start putting him in that, but I put him in everything because my daughter has no interest in it. But what your parents did, introduce you to many things. He's actually a good writer. So I pushed him into writing, and they kept saying in school, writing was a strong point. Well, now he actually is a good songwriter. And what I say to him, music, this is a small percentage. It's like being an athlete. It's like being an actor. You can't rely on that. You've got to have a background. And if you want to be in that industry, I was modeled when I was young, but by the time you hit 30, 35, it starts to fade away. So you better have some longevity, right? So that was one of the things I set up, like your parents. You better be able to produce, and be like a Pharrell and Dr. Dre, like be able to do things so you could be 60 years old, because nobody wants to hear you singing and rapping at 50. It's not cute.
I mean, sometimes they do, but no, but
We have Diddy and some of these other ones trying to rap, and then my kids go, those are the old school days. I'm like, first of all, we're their parents, we started that generation. They're like, whatever, it's corny.
It's but focusing on skills, right? I think that's what I'm hearing is sort of the idea of skill sets, right? Writing,
right.
And singing, and understanding, hey, be as good as you can possibly be at that, and
Right.
that discipline, those habits, then can translate to other things or to fusions of that piece, and yeah, that's exactly 100% what you're talking about with your son. Is when I look back, right? It's always hindsight is 2020, right? In the moment,
Right.
we're like, I just want to go
Doesn't
home,
that set you up
etc.
for
But
the testing? Doesn't it set you up for testing? Because I think that part of the testing is not really how intelligent you are academically. Is it? That's what I've heard. And for some reason, I don't remember having to take the test, because I think I started doing well in school at a young age. So I went back to school at 30, which I tell people it's harder, because it was something you said earlier. When you do go back to school later and you have your kids, you were like, okay, I want to go get my education. I had to take a statistics class, and I literally was crying, because I'm like, I wasn't a really strong math student anyway. My son got the writing skill from me, and the math is my husband. And I would cry because I could not figure out. I had to retake that class, ended up getting a good grade, but I had to get tutors at 30 years old. Once I'm in a class with a whole bunch of youngsters, and I'm asking, the kids are tutoring me. Even though 30 is young, you still feel like an old person when you're in school with college kids.
I've had some opportunities to help some professionals who are like applying for like licensing, right? And they might have some type of statistics or math exam, and you're right. You know, the distance from that education. I think even Martine, thinking about being in a doctoral program, right? And you're all of a sudden having to write a 10-page paper with APA formatting and having to research again, and it's sort of these different skills that you just don't use on a day-to-day basis, right? Like one of my students, I remember being like, I can sell you a $4 million penthouse, but man, do I really need to worry about sort of this standard deviation or this percentage, this compounding interest or whatever. So um, it is interesting in terms of the organization that comes with it, and even going back to the testing component. I would agree with you. I think that the amount of intelligence that is required, and if we're talking, I mean, just to frame it a little bit, if we're talking about, an ACT, SAT, right? So it's a test you're taking when you're 16, 17, 18 years old, even though this could apply, frankly, to a lot of other different tests. Um, Organization, discipline, the time to do it, right? This is something we've talked about, Martina and I, about how sometimes people will sit there and say, oh, this is about the materials that you have, and sometimes it's literally the time. If I need to go home, right, and take care of other responsibilities, and that affects how I prep, right? Do you have the time to actually prep? Do you have the time, the timeline, right? Like I'm losing my phrasing here, but anyway, like, do you have 2 months to take that test, or do you have to take it in 3 weeks? And I think that your results are going to significantly change. And so I think when we start to think about testing as it relates to these parameters, you start to see how socioeconomic, and sort of in general gate kept knowledge, right, can have a significant impact on that exam, which then can sort of cascade into other results because of it. So
Carlos, can you explain the gate? Like you keep saying gatekeeper. Can you explain what traditionally those gatekeeper things are? And how do they put together these tests in the first place?
gotcha. Okay. Well, gatekeeping in general, just as a term, is sort of the knowledge that right? Like if I were to say I really want to become a famous singer, right? There are certain things that certain people know, right? That are just certain groups of people know, and that's why you hire experts and professionals. And this can be for any field, right? But when it comes to testing, right, and you're saying this is a requirement for you going to college, all of a sudden it becomes abundantly clear, right, who has access to these resources and who doesn't, right? I mean, you can go and quickly search any news outlet and say, test prep, and you start to see the discrepancies that emerge. And so when it comes to sort of that gatekeeping mentality, is, do you know what's even on the test, right? Do you just have one pamphlet that your counselor gave you, or do you have an entire course that's integrated into your curriculum as a class, right? Those are just examples of just differences among private schools that I've worked with, right? We're not even talking about public schools, right? So with that in mind, I guess, Martin, to take a step back and think about the test, right? So you have your ACT, your SAT, and you have other sort of derivatives, right? PSAT and PLAN and et cetera. But those two core ACT and SATs usually test the areas of grammar, math, reading, and science. There are optional essay components, but that post COVID has become less of a focus. And then kids can take them multiple times. They can super score, which essentially means you take the best subject score from each exam. And each test that you take, right, is expensive. It can be 40, 50, 60 bucks, right? And so now you're talking about not only one exam, but 3, 4, 5 exams that some students are taking in order to achieve one parameter of applying to college. So that sort of ACT, SAT start, um, regardless of what the intentions were when they started the test, has become sort of this other component. And And, we have test optional movements now, which is supremely helpful. But still, I think there's a lot of work to be done.
And what about like preparation as far as getting counseling and you helping the kids? Like, what is the cost of that? Because it goes back to the means. Like my friend who was preparing her son, they finally got him in USC, went to Santa Monica, and they're the ones that guided me to do that with my son and then switch him over. But just even preparing, they had him take the test twice, but they had these classes that cost like $2,000 a course just to prepare him to get him there. What about the kids that don't have the means? And the system's set up to me that way, even with my son going to school. My son being a boy is opposite experience of what I'm having with my daughter, which my daughter is very ambiguous looking anyway. And because of that, her experience, how she's been treated in school, and not to bring up the racial part of it, but it's really a major factor. Even if you have the means for your kids to go to private school, it becomes a major factor to try to, the road you have, the plan, the money you put in, they try to put your kid on this road. So after you spent a few $100,000 from kindergarten in private school, you don't get there, where you're trying to achieve. So can you explain the factor of the disproportionate economic part of why that they don't get to do the test, why that they don't pass the test? Also, I think economic is part of it from what I understand. Now, my daughter is about to take it, I'm sure, in a couple of years, and I need to know what to prepare her because she is my academic kid. My son is more of the creative kid, right? So he's planning to go to music school at USC, which he's going to be able to pass those tests right now. Like certain bypass having to go through that process.
Right.
But I need to know what to do to prepare her for getting on that road.
Yeah, it's a
really, I can touch it there for you.
a really complicated. I'm like,
okay, so I want to know about the economic part of it. Then I wanted to know about the social and the racial bias, your experience and how much it costs in preparing, and what can we do to achieve and make it easier. Put it in simple terms for me.
So I think that. So I think that when we're thinking of how do we make testing fair, right? And again, we're ignoring the sort of test optional piece for a second, which I think we should definitely chat about, because then the focus becomes the admissions process and essay writing and et cetera, which is a whole other stage. But when you're looking at the testing component, I think that first of all, the early exposure to these exams is key, right? They become this piece that you're like, okay, I'm going to definitely take the ACT, or I'm going to definitely take the SAT, depending on what school I go to, right? What my counselor tells me, which already sometimes can be a disadvantage. And to sort of give you a couple differences is when it comes to SAT, right? You're looking at a test that has about time and a half compared to ACT for certain sections, right? So for example, if you're a slower reader, SAT might have more time per passage than ACT does, right? In exchange for maybe a slightly more difficult reading level. And so you have these differences between tests that when you're exposed to them earlier on, even if you're not prepping yet, it allows to alleviate a little bit of that stress of the format. And also just the whole idea of giving yourself that runway. That was what I was thinking about earlier. The runway to be able to prep so it doesn't up the pressure, because one of the other components is the pressure of getting the score you need, right? Because you go and you take this test and you walk away on a Saturday or a Sunday, and then you wait 2.5 weeks, and then you get a number. And if that number isn't what you need, now you start the process again, right? And if I'm a teenager, actually anybody, period, forget about teenager, right? I'm taking this exam, the stress and the pressure that comes from maybe that second exam as well, saying, okay, I did really well in grammar, but now I need to really up my math performance. Just it sets all, and we're forgetting about, school, right? And I need to write research papers and pass exams. And so the timing of when you prep as well. So I think that's why it's important to do more planning early on. And then, then focus on the actual material and the format and et cetera. And I think that if we add a socioeconomic or a racial lens to it, I think that it gets more difficult because it's when you're introduced to it, right? Let's not even get into the different factors, the prior knowledge. Motivationally, do I have role models in my community that are teaching me, or is everybody who's teaching me that they don't look like me, right? Because that by itself, from an instructional theory standpoint, is just very that's a whole other complex level of variables, right? So if we ignore that and we focus on simply the exposure to the information, right, and understanding what's even coming, I think that type of preparation can even the scales a little bit, right? Because it allows students and families to then say, okay, I know what's coming, right? And not just my junior year, my sophomore year, my freshman year. I understand what's coming. I understand it's one piece of the puzzle, and especially post-COVID, it's a smaller piece of the puzzle. And the pressure is there, but it's not as great. When do I prepare for this? My kid's a big football player. I can't do it during the fall. I need to do it during the winter and spring of my junior year. Or junior year is horrible at my school. So therefore I need to prepare my end of my sophomore year. And it's okay because my student is in a more advanced math course. So they're prepared to take this exam because now, with kids taking calculus their junior year or sophomore year or whatever, sometimes waiting longer to the traditional second semester of junior year can actually be a disservice because you've forgotten, right? To go back to our conversation of statistics, when you're 30, you might be like, I'm taking calculus my junior year, but I need to remember my algebra 1 skills that I learned in 7th.
Exactly. That's what's happened to me.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I have a lot of students now who are actually testing earlier. And I don't necessarily think, I love my students. They're great. I don't necessarily think that they're more intelligent than earlier generations of my students. They just are taking and are being exposed to academic material earlier on.
Yes.
So it makes sense for them to test.
I noticed that.
Yeah. And so that I think that the access to that knowledge, I think is one component. I think there are a lot of different, other components, like maybe schools should be incorporating this into their curriculum, just like computer science is a part of it. If you're going to make a test essential to get into a particular college, then maybe it should be part of that curriculum that's offered by your school. Again, the argument then goes, well, if test optional is the future, right? You look at the UC system and just in general, most of the schools across the nation went test optional for COVID. And now most of them said we're going to keep this in place. Then how else do you support students, right? And I still think access to information and education, not only of the student, but of the family, of the parent, of the household that you're spending the majority of the time with, so that us as parents, we're equipped to help our students and say, hey, you really need to start looking at this exam now, and you don't need to stress about the whole thing at this moment. And that sort of planning is key for success. So sorry, that's a really long answer, but
no, it helps a lot.
Yeah.
Carlos, what do you think? And I know, Elon, you probably have thought about, because you and I have had this conversation too. It's a big money maker, obviously, for these big testing. They've become massive corporations in some way. And I know they did a lot of pushback on, no, these tests are not racially biased. No, these tests don't hurt anybody if they're poorer. Do you see, how do they even develop this? How did the SAT and all these, were these developed by universities? How did this whole testing thing become this much of a big deal now? Do you have any idea of how this started, and then why they gave this so much weight?
I think that, to not put myself in a historically inaccurate position, what I would say is this: when you're looking at national and international tests, you're looking for a way to evaluate students beyond their school's parameters, right? So you want that kid from Missouri or Tennessee or California to be able to be compared in some level. So I think that was sort of the original intention of ACT and SAT. The problem with this is that you have to really consider that when you make something so competitive, right? When something's so instrumental to a process, and I think this can be applied to many things beyond testing, people are going to prepare the best way that they can, right? You want to give your child every advantage possible. The problem with that is that some people can give much greater advantages to it than others. And
Yeah.
so we've seen it, right? I don't want to talk necessarily about specific things that have been in the news or in
Right.
Netflix or anything like that, but we very well know what happens when you start to put that much emphasis on one component.
Right.
So that I think is where we start. And what has happened now with test optional is that now you're putting focus on essays, you're putting focus on interviews, for example, or other or extracurriculars, right? You have kids who are like in 50 clubs now because I know that I need to have, those 10 activities on my common application really shine. And sometimes it's like, hey, maybe you should be in 3 clubs, take care of your schoolwork, get your GPA where it needs to be, and be a leader in those 3 clubs. And that you'll learn far more for your future that way than trying to play the game of admissions. But that's a really complicated answer. I mean, like, how do you even, I don't, to be frank with you, I don't know. But I know that from our company's standpoint and just in general, BEC standpoint and a couple other initiatives and organizations that I'm working with, where our focus is going outside of testing now and saying, hey,
Yeah.
testing is one piece, but do you know how to shake someone's hand and look, well, I guess a little different now, but look someone in the eye and actually speak to them, and public speaking and resume building, and
So
do you
much
know how to
stuff.
network? That stuff is just as valuable, right? And I
Yeah.
think that we have put so much focus on what school we go to, and believe me, there are great universities, but just Elon, to just take a step back and just go back to the racial lens that we talked about earlier. Me as a Colombian, right? I look at it as a Latino. I look at this as I go to different institutions, right? And I go from 2-year institutions to 4-year community colleges to higher schools. There are less of me at those
Oh,
levels,
yeah.
right? Like diversity is something at higher education. That's a whole other conversation that sometimes we have to really think about, what are we trying to achieve with these exams, with these processes? You want people to succeed, not only to get into the school, but to stay there, to succeed, and then also to serve as role models for future generations to continue gaining access, right? And I think that there's a lot of very interesting literature and evolution within the professional world of where college degrees come into play. But the fact of the matter is that I feel extremely blessed to have gone to the university that I did, and my path could have been different had I gone to a different university. And I think and that's for me coming from a blessed home, and I was able to study and etc. I couldn't afford tutoring, right? But I was fortunate. I had 2 parents in the
Well, having
household.
educated parents too.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly,
having
exactly.
educated parents played a big factor, because one of the
100%.
things, and just to add to what you're saying, and without getting too much into the whole political
Mhm,
part of the racial
mhm,
thing, but is my kids going to private school. One of the interesting thing is my daughter goes to a more prestigious school. My son's been in several different ones for different reasons.
mhm.
But I noticed that there's very few Hispanic people throughout this process. So if you get into the universities that you get into, is like, as a Black person, we have to work much harder, and you have to work much harder in the public schools because there's not as many Hispanic kids. And the only reason why in my opinion, and I've had this conversation with my daughter's school, that they let the Black kids in, is because of sports. And so with my daughter's school, we would go to the assemblies, her particular school, and there was not one boy in the lower school for 5 years I was there. So they asked me to be on the board, and I was like, oh, that's for a diversity thing. And I was like, oh, you don't want, my husband's like, you don't want that. So I had this conversation with them, and I said, listen, they were like, we are so diverse. We have Indian, we have Asian, we have this, we have that. And I said, you know what? I did not see in the last 5 years one Black boy in the lower school. You have maybe 3 Black girls in the whole school, which I don't think that's diverse. And saying you have Indian kids, whatever, you have all these different minorities, that doesn't represent America. America is more Black, brown, and white. Like, we don't see any Hispanic kids. There's no Black kids. And I let them know. But I have to say, with her particular school, not with my son's other schools, I noticed that they finally start letting them in. But my argument was, when you let them in junior high and they said, oh, we have them coming in junior high, high school, not even junior high, high school. And they said, you know what, we know what's going on. You want them to play your sports to get your numbers up. And if they don't start from kindergarten and you come from public school, the academic is so strong in this school, they can't handle it. So you've got to pass them. Then they don't have the opportunity to go to college. They can't get in because their grades are not strong enough. My daughter's speaking Mandarin in as a little kid. You know, she's on honors class, but she started in kindergarten. So if we don't get this, they go, well, we want you to get used to seeing people like us. I said, no, that's the problem. We don't need to see kids and get used to your world. We live in your world. You need to your kids need to see our kids at kindergarten. So you know it's a normal thing to go to school with minority kids and that don't think that you are in a different class than them, because you're conditioning these kids when they come in, oh, they're good at sports, oh, they're good at that area in high school. It should start at kindergarten. And I said, so this is the problem. So you can't go and toot your horn and say, I prepared them, because these kids, it's not because they're not smart. They just don't have the opportunity to start young. Your academic is very strong. And I think all kids are capable of learning. Some learn later than others, and some are a little bit smarter, but most of them can learn if you start early on with the curriculum. So by the time it's opportunity for them to get the SATs and all the tests they need to take, they can't do it in high school. And that's what I've seen. And I just wanted to touch on that because I know you didn't want to get into that, but I've seen it personally and I told them about it. And even the schools, one of the reasons why we've had so many problems with my son is my husband's like 6'3", right? And I'm 5'9". My son was like literally 4'11" when he started high school. I have pictures of him at 16 and he's like 5'3". He was tiny. He just was a little kid. And so we put him in football and just, you know, he was too small really by the time. When he was in pop and he was little, it was fine. But when he got to junior high, those kids were big. And that's one of the reasons why he wasn't able to really keep up with everyone in sports. But that was the thing for which comes into the racial thing for the diversity. It becomes about the athletics for the school to make the athletics look good, but they don't focus on the academics. So the kids have the opportunity to go to USC, like Martine, and you can get into those good schools. You know, I just think that what you're doing is amazing to be able to have kids that can have those programs. Like, what programs can we get? Because one of the things my friend said to me, well, you know, I have a friend who moved overseas. Well, you know, the kids can just get on the computer and learn, and it's so easy. And I said, do you ever think about the kids don't have computers in the inner cities, and then they don't have internet? Who's going to pay for the internet for them to have the computers? So of course we want to help, but not to get into that, like I already did, but that plays into factors of preparing for these tests, like all that, because they don't have the means, they don't have the resources.
Well, and you know, I think that pulling everything that you're saying, it's and actually a very common theme that we've been looking into recently is the difference between equality and equity. Right. So you're talking about, it's interesting to give access and say, as a school, right, and say, I give every kid the same, right? They get the same books, the same opportunities, the same, et cetera. But the problem with that is that not every kid needs, right? Some need more, some need less. And it can be based on racial factors, socioeconomic factors, geographical factors, right? There are other components that come into it. And so I think that when we're discussing equity, right, we need to talk about meeting kids where they're at. Right? What do they need to be motivated, to be successful, to be persistent, right? Because they're all going to experience some type of adversity, right? Mm-hmm. How do we make sure that they're able to confront that adversity, learn from that, and go beyond it? And so I think that when you're talking about, you know, your son and daughter and the school and et cetera, I think that's classic, right? Like, hey, we're just giving them everything that they need. And it's like, that's not what they need. You're giving everybody the same. And there's a subtle but very powerful distinction between those pieces, and that's something that I think from what I do that I'm very fortunate. It's in some ways unintentional the way that it started, but I'm sort of in like the boutique world, right? So I do a lot of one-on-one, small group, et cetera, on that end. So it allows me to personalize what I provide, right? My test prep does not look the same for each kid or even each group or even each year, right? It depends on how the tests are evolving. It depends on what the students need. During COVID, our curriculum was extremely different, obviously, than before and after, right? And so that component, it makes me even think of some of the students that we help. I have one particular student who is currently at a very elite institution, and the way the preparing in his case had a lot to do with motivation and organization, and not in terms of ability. I mean, this kid is a genius, right? And
Wow.
he could teach me a lot of stuff. And he has. And I think that the way that my prep in that case, my job was not to teach him new knowledge. It was to sort of facilitate his learning, to make sure that he had the resources that he needed, and to serve as a sounding board when things got stressful, and they did, right? And sometimes they had nothing to do. I mean, in his situation, it could have been, hey, I'm going through a green card process, or and those were far realer and more important things, but he still had to take the test in a month. So seeing how you could compromise and find the path for him to succeed, right? And that's obviously an extreme example, right? But the fact of the matter is every student has all these different challenges and different capacities. And so when we think of how do we help them, right, we have to consider that every kid needs different things. And that's what I hear you saying. It's equity is not about, hey, here's what everybody else has, because that's assuming that your background and the way that you see the world, right, whether it's race, whether it's another lens, right, is the same. And that is just completely wrong. And so yeah, that's 100%, resonates. Yeah, for sure.
It's just life experience, and it goes back what you originally said. It's timing and preparing. So sometimes you don't have the right preparation to prepare for this, that you could probably pass, but you just don't have the preparation to do what it takes to get there, right?
Or someone tell you, hey, you're stressing too much, right? You're stressing too much about this. You're good. Like, hey, listen, you got that score. That's fine. You getting an extra point or two is going to take 3 months of preparation. Instead, based on the way that this process works, you know what? You should go and pursue your love of music and, get involved in a nonprofit that teaches music lessons for free. Because you know what? When it comes to applying and also, your development as a person, let's, just think of that for a second as well. That's probably more valuable or equally as valuable as doing this preparation for this extra point or two that you might or might not get. And so that type of, opportunity cost, right? And those conversations, sometimes it's essential that those happen far more than learning the quadratic formula a little bit better.
Hey, Carlos.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question. Like what if, like, I went to a school where they don't even, the topic of college doesn't come up at all. So, growing up in a pretty poor area of Oakland, the whole notion of going to college was not even something. You know what the option was? Like, hey, what are you going to go out and do out of school? I mean, can you find a job that you can do something with your hands, or join the military? Yeah, or join the military. So, because like you said, everybody else is struggling to live day to day, let alone thinking about college. What advice do you give to people that are in a situation where most of the kids don't go to college? And the people and the community are surrounded it, like Elon was saying, there's no role models in the community. Your role models are people that are, some folks are doing good stuff and some folks are not are doing some stuff they shouldn't be doing. What do you do in those situations?
That's a great question. I'm thinking recently of one of my students that was in a situation like that, where, I mean, to not get into excessive amount of detail, the communication provided to him and his particular school it was very clearly geared towards a different result than college, right? It was let me talk like the hip kids do, right? And you could see this language that was very clearly holding him to a different standard. And I've seen this across the board over, I've been doing this now, I mean, almost 2 decades, right? And so with what ended up happening was that, I mean, in my case, I was like, hey, U of I, right, University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign has something called the Illinois Promise, where they cover full tuition if your family makes below a certain amount, as long as you fill out the FAFSA and you have a certain GPA. And this kid was a 4.0. Access to that information, right? That's where I feel like empowering community leaders, community centers, places where students can go. Sometimes school is not the place where you can get that, right? Not to get too academic about it, but we assume sometimes when we're preparing students for college, right? When we step beyond even test prep, when we're talking college in general, that college is the goal. And a lot of times that just, it can be anything from cultural to financial to etc. Sometimes that's something that doesn't fall within your scope. You say, I can't do that. I have to take care of my younger siblings. I have to help my mom. I have to, etc. And so finding ways to say, hey, yeah, maybe it isn't leaving the house, right? Maybe it is that you're going to a local university, and they have these programs for commuters, right? Or, hey, you should go to a junior college for a year or two, and here's your path to then apply to a 4-year university.
Right.
I think that all of those, that access to knowledge comes with empowering community centers, nonprofits with that information and that expertise to be able to provide students. And for them who are interacting with students on, problems and issues that are far beyond academics, right? Sometimes it's, am I going to be alive or not, right? Like there are other, so much more important things that sometimes for us to go in as educators and say, hey, you should go to college. It's just, you say, well, that's nice. That's great. I'll put that on my
You're
list.
right. Exactly.
I'm number
It's easy for me to
15.
say.
Yeah. And so instead you empower the people who are helping them navigate these complicated situations, in neighborhoods and situations that you have no business telling them what is important and what is not, right? Your
Right.
job as an educator or as a facilitator is to make sure that they have access to the information, that you provide all the support that you can to the organizations that are helping you, empower them. And sometimes that isn't the school. And that is okay, right? As long as you're taking that initiative. That's Martin, that's a great point, right? And in this case, this student ended up going to U of I, right? Which, by the way, was not even in the cards initially, right? Initially, it was I should either go to community college, junior college, etc. He wants to be a surgeon, and so and both his parents are first generation, right? Highest level I think that they achieved was either middle school or maybe a few years of high school, right? So from their standpoint, they couldn't, they were like, we want you to work hard, we want you to succeed,
Yeah.
but they didn't have the tools, right? And so they were like, hey, how do we get this kid to do this? And also, oh, by the way, he's a teenager. So there comes a whole other myriad of factors where it's like, hey, don't get up at noon, try to get up at 10 a.m. and do some of your work, right? Like there's a bunch of other complications that come with that outside of academics, and just saying, this is where we want you to end up. And this kid, he just finished his first semester 4.0, right? Wow. U of I. I mean, like, it's awesome, right? And here you're also talking, and again, not to go too far in one direction, but here we're talking about someone who he goes to med school, becomes a surgeon, right? And becomes a role model for generations of students, right? This is how you uplift communities, right? Yeah. And not just one individual. And I think that it's so impactful, right? And so, Martin, to go back to even to your question and just thought in general, is how do we empower these sort of ambassadors, right? How do we empower these individuals to then come back and give back to their community as well? Right. For him to go to his school and talk to students that are 15, 16, 17, and 18 and tell them, this is what I did, you can do it, is far more impactful than me going there and saying, you can do it. As much as I might know the process, you listen to the people who you're like, yes, you've been there. You understand what it's like to grow up here. And I think that we see a lot of times that sort of role model power, right? When it comes,
Carlos, it saddens me because you look at like my situation growing up. I wasn't, I had to kind of figure it out. And then you have a situation like you have a parent like Elon she has the resources, and it's confusing for her too.
Mhm.
So it's so frustrating that they've created a situation where, you know, we're all kind of struggling with trying to figure out how to achieve success, how to pass standardized tests that some
Right.
people have significant advantages over. It's like, how do you navigate, and what advice would you give parents and even adult learners? What kind of advice would you give us to cope with this kind of stuff, to even feel like we're empowered to pass these tests? Like Elon was saying, like she's smart because she went back, but it was a struggle for her at 30. I mean, and there's a lot of people that don't have her drive that will say, I'm done. I can't do
Yeah.
it. I mean, she's a success story, right? But for every one of those success stories, we have so many people that fall off that ladder or, don't have that drive. What kind of advice would you give?
And I just want to add teachers that are encouraging, because
Mhm.
I was going to bring up my son's situation and my situation. You have some of the educators are like, well, I made it and I came from that background. And I actually found that with some of the minority people were even worse, because they're like, well, how could you not do that? I didn't have that experience growing up in as a teenager, because I had a famous father, but I didn't realize at the time until I started having kids going to school, because I was like, well, I can afford to send them at this time to private school. Why are you mistreating us? Why do my kids get to deserve that? And I realized, because it was the racial thing, and because I went to school when there was no minority kids. It's just because I just had that background, not realizing it. I remember when I went back to school in my 30s, one of the professors gave me a grade that I said, this is totally isn't right. I know for sure everything is wrong. And why did you give me that grade? And he made some nasty comment. And I said, at that time, I might've been like 33, 34. I said, I'm 34 years old. I don't have parents sending me here. I'm going to graduate with or without you. I took this class because I thought I would enjoy it, but you're purposely trying to keep me from graduating. I'm going to graduate because I came back to school by choice. My parents are not making me go to school. Now, this is when I didn't even have kids. I can't imagine what you're doing to these children, because it's clear what your agenda is to try to hinder me, right? I end up experiencing that later on with my own child. So it's the educators like yourself who is so inspiring, want to help. You understand, you knew that you grew up with not, I want to say privilege, but you had the
Mhm.
resources and parents, right? And you encouraged this kid, and he turned out to be a surgeon, and he's going back and helping. We need more people like that, because you have the ones that just educators that are like, oh, well, I made it. So, you should be able to do it. I figured it out. And then it gives those kids, they don't have hope. So that goes back to how our experiences are different, and yours was harder, Martine, but it still was a struggle. And it was so much stress on me as a parent. We still are trying to navigate and figure it out. So even though it may seem like mine was easier, it wasn't.
Different challenges.
We need people
Right?
like you for help. But as I'm saying, we need more Carlos to help, because there's a lot of people that are just selfish like that.
And I think also, I would say that it's sometimes it's the selfish component, but sometimes it's also what they needed to do to get to where they are. And when they get to that point, and this goes to one component I've seen with my students, and that now is something I always mention from the very beginning, is understanding that part of your responsibility in these educational experiences and journeys is to give back.
Mhm.
Right? That is, you have the privilege of being educated, and this goes, I think, across races, right? I don't think it's necessarily only minorities. I think that the understanding that when you reach a certain level, when you are able to attend that undergraduate or graduate or whatever, part of your job during that education and after is to give back, and
Yes.
to understand that you might have been one of the people who did not make it, and because you did, you have the responsibility. I think instilling that from early on, right? And I see a lot of my families, who, kids are volunteering, from an early age. They're understanding that, peer tutoring and, like, oh, giving music lessons. I have a lot of students who do that, which I think is the coolest thing, right?
Mhm.
Those are skills that are instilled early on, so that when you are at that level and now you're able to give back, it's just something you do. You understand that it's part of your responsibility to your community and just as a society as a whole, right? And also, I think the other piece, Martine, just to get back even to your comment as well, is understanding that your why is going to be different, right? So from an educator standpoint, one of the things that I tell my team, right, and also just conversations that I've had with a lot of brilliant educators within my doctoral program, but just and also outside of that, is that you need to understand why you're doing this, right? You're not doing this because you want to go because you want to get a good score on the ACT or because you want to get into this particular education. If it is, then it becomes very difficult once that happens, if it happens, for you then to find motivation afterward, right? Understanding what your why is, really taking time to look into that and instilling that as part of your education in high school and middle school, et cetera, is really, really important. And I think the other piece of this is sort of the persistence, right? This is something that I've been experiencing even recently, right? With my applicants. Not everybody says yes initially, right? When it comes to college, you get deferred, you get waitlisted. There are other steps that go into it, and it's tough. It's emotionally taxing. I cannot, I'm a little bit more callous because I've gone through, at this point, probably 15 seasons worth of applications. So I've seen it all, right? I've seen it all. And well, I shouldn't say that because now I see something different. But I've seen kids when those 4.0s open that application and they're like, "Oh my God, I didn't get in." And in the back of your head, it's probably because you didn't visit or because they don't think you're actually going to go here, right? And you actually were never going to go there either. But that's a whole other conversation. And so, understanding that the challenge and the path is different, right? And that with one rejection, right, or one acceptance, it's not over. And I think that to me has been something that I've realized, with the test optional, with the applications, with accommodations, even, right? Like applying to take an exam, and you have learning disabilities, you need to actually go and get accommodations, apply for accommodations, go through appeal processes sometimes, right? Even though, well, anyway, I don't really want to go down that path, but it's a whole process that can last for years.
Mm-hmm.
And so trying to sort of teach that mental fortitude, right? That ability to take those punches and still be able to move forward. And I think that again comes back to, do you understand why you're doing this, right? Why is it that you want to become that surgeon? Or why is it that you want to become that computer programmer? Because you want to X, Y, and Z. And I think that the more we help facilitate that as educators, the more successful our students will be, but also the more impact they will have on future generations when the three of us are not here, right?
Hey, Carlos, what do you do if I say, and I think Elon was saying this, like she was saying her son, there's a lot of people I know that have this issue, regardless of age, is what advice would you give someone that says, I'm just not a good standardized test taker. I'm a good writer. I excel in these areas. I feel like I don't know what to do because I know I have a 4.0 or I do well in school. I'm not a good standardized test taker. What advice and how do you prepare someone for this, for a standardized test if you're not good at it?
That's a great question. I think there's a couple things, right? One is understanding what your capacity is to prepare for them, right? I think that's where it starts, right? I don't think there's harm for you to take a practice test or to leaf through a booklet and get an idea of what it is. I have some students who will go through the process, but with the understanding that it might not be something that you're going to embark upon, right? And that can have a significant effect on resources that you apply to it, right? Time that you apply to it, right? But if you're actually going to prep, you should devote the time, right? It doesn't necessarily mean you need tutoring. It could just be that you're very organized and you're using, a test prep book or practice exams, etc. But that you devote the appropriate time to it. And if after all that effort, right, and you look at that, or the effort that you decided to devote to it, you're like, this doesn't work for me, that's okay, right? If this was 15 years ago, 10 years ago, right, we would have a different conversation. But now most schools are test optional. So you look and you say, all right, what are the skills that I have? What are the strengths that I bring to the table? And how can I improve in those areas? I'm a great writer, spectacular. What kind of internships and summer programs can you find out about in order to increase those skills? Can you diversify the type of writing that you're embarking upon? Is there songwriting, screenwriting, right? There are so many other avenues, and I feel like that exposure early on and that initiative to find these different avenues to show the strengths to universities, and also just the professional world, can have so much more of a positive impact than stressing about whether one test defines you. I mean, and that's kind of the irony of my situation, right? I help kids prepare for tests, but sometimes the kids that I help don't, right? They do other things. We work on college apps. We work on soft skills. We work on connecting them with different internship programs or different summer programs. Because at the end of the day, if you really think that every single kid should take a standardized test, then you're feeding into a system that a lot of times for students just isn't. I mean, it's not fair. I don't even know
Well, let me ask you this, Carlos, and Elon, I know you got questions. I want to make sure you I want to make sure you ask, because I know Elon's ready to go. She's in the middle of this right now, so that's why she's got good questions for you. This is a loaded question, and Elon, I know you probably thought about this too. Does it hurt if it's optional? It's almost like when you apply for when you take an exam or you apply for a job, and they give you essay questions, and there's one that's optional. It's always been my experience. Is it really optional? Because
Right.
I've learned if it's optional, I'm going to go ahead and do it.
Exactly.
So the question is, if the UC say it's optional, it's confusing to me again, because if I'm giving advice to somebody and they say, Fig, it's optional, I'm going to say, you better take it anyway, because has it been your experience at universities, if it's optional, why even make it optional if you're saying that it's not gonna matter or weigh in whether someone gets accepted or not? It's like, it just doesn't make any sense to me, because if somebody has a 4.0 and they take the test, and then this other student over here has a 4.0 and decides not to take it, are they going to give it to the person that decided to take that test?
Yeah.
And Martine, that's the question you're never going to get a direct answer, right? most admissions people will tell you that that's not the case. The conversations I've had, right? And I want to be very upfront, because I think that, admissions officers sometimes get a bad rep, right? They're definitely the ones who are reading your application. They're advocating for you to the group. And, when you have 100,000 applications, sometimes the smallest things can disqualify you, right? And I would be naive to think that the situation of one kid has it and one kid doesn't and everything else is identical wouldn't maybe yield a positive result for test preparations. So what I would say in this case is, what I've heard in general is, you take the test, and if the test complements your GPA, you include it. However, if you are a 5.0, you essentially are 3 steps away from inventing the next big thing. And testing just isn't, like, you're getting scores that are not at the level that equates with your GPA, right? You're just not scoring in that percentile that you need to. It can actually be a disservice to send that score.
But Carlos, how do you do that if when you apply, at least on and Elon, when you're applying it as a teenager, they ask you what schools you want to apply for.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's automatically reported to them. So if I wanted
not anymore.
Okay, so they don't do that anymore then.
So yeah, exactly. Okay. So that's really interesting. Yeah, that's a really good point. So what ends up happening now is that you have control. Like, I can speak for example, Chicago Public Schools. They have a state requirement for SAT, right? So every kid in the Chicago Public Schools takes the SAT. However, you have to opt in for them to send that score, right? And so And so you have control, right? A lot of my seniors don't send their scores until September or August of their senior year, right, to the universities because they want to see how it all turns out, right? So it's that's actually, Martin, that's actually a really, really good point. Like now you have more control over your scores than you used to. So you're able to at least, but again, what happens if you start too late and you're taking the October test your senior year? You don't have time because you have a November 1st deadline. So that's again where runway becomes such a big factor. But if you start early enough, you have your numbers, you can then make those decisions and consult with your school counselor, sometimes even the reps of the schools themselves, especially a lot of universities have specific reps for diverse candidates. So you can ask, hey, listen, I'm first generation. I don't know. Is this a good score based on my GPA and score? And a lot of times they're able to direct you to resources. They won't obviously give you the answer, but they're able to direct you to resources. And also, yeah, it just in general, it's so difficult, right? Because you just don't know. So the best course of action, and what I always tell any student or family that I'm working with or mentoring or whatever, is that you need to make sure that you have your scores in time, so you start early enough, and that you provide the scores to the schools where it complements. So, for example, Elon, not to use Yale as an example, right? But like for example, for Yale, if I don't have the test score for Yale, but I do have the test score to apply to my state school, for example, right? I should send that test score to the state school with my GPA and then not send my test score to Yale and let them evaluate my GPA, right?
Right.
Because
Right.
that you just don't want something to distract from the things that you
Distract.
achieved,
Right.
right? But that sort of choosing, right, is really important because from an
Yeah.
admissions standpoint, I don't want to be distracted, right? I don't want to ask questions. I'm already asking a ton of questions. I'm already reading a ton of essays. I don't want to be looking and saying, that's a kind of low test score. You just don't want that even to be a factor in the decision. Now, a lot of schools will say, listen, we won't even look at it, right? Or it's such a small piece, but you don't know, and you get one shot, right? So a lot of times that sort of decision for any elite school, period. I think and that's where information also provided to you by your school, right? Which is where I think community centers, et cetera, need to be even a greater resource. Some schools provide you with the average ACT and SATs that university has admitted the past 3, 4, 5 years. What if you don't have access to that data? And so, right, because the question that naturally comes from this is, okay, great, Carlos, this sounds so good. What's a good test score? One of the favorite questions that I get all the time.
Yes.
What's a good
I was going to ask that.
And you just say, it just depends. It depends where you're applying, what your GPA is, how that test score is distributed, right? Are you trying to be an engineer and your math is a 36, which is a perfect score on the ACT, or is your math, really low? So if you're applying to engineering school, you should just stick to your A's and your math and leave that test score,
Leave that test
outside of
score
the
alone.
equation, right? So that's where the guidance, and that's frankly where a lot of inequity comes from. Because
Speaking of inequity, I was going to ask, because my daughter's going in 10th grade, right? So, just not only that, there's a two-part to this. When you start meeting with the counselors, because that's coming up now, college prep, right? The attitude, or because you're independent, a lot of these teachers won't necessarily tell you what you need or preparation, because it's not only just the test scores, it's also taking the proper classes to get into the proper schools that you want to go. So a ninth grader may not know what schools they want to go to at that point, right? And if you decide by their 11th grade, 12th grade, you want to go to an Ivy League school or you want to go to a state school, that will be the easier process, a state school, as you just mentioned. But if you want to go to a Yale or a Harvard, how do you get in there if you don't have the right guidance because you didn't get the right classes, because it's not just your GPA? And because my daughter's so academic, because of COVID, a lot of the kids kept getting sick. And my daughter got sick last year. And she didn't get COVID, but she kept getting really ill or whatever. We didn't know. Maybe it was, but we didn't know at that time. But I had to fight for my daughter to get into an honors class, right? It was an honors geometry. And this teacher, who was head of the math department, was so angry when I walked in that she didn't acknowledge me. And she challenged me, and I had to sign something. And I said, first of all, my husband went to Yale and he majored in economics. He's in finance. That's what he does. So I'm not a math person, but we have the resources. And she's always been a great math student, and just give her the opportunity. But why are you keeping her from going into this math class? And her attitude was, well, my experience, this and this. So they had to do something called proofs, which my daughter is great at equations. It was very challenging for her. And she was struggling. So for the first time, and my son always had to have a tutor. I had to get her a tutor. And we got my son's tutor, which the tutor loves her because she's such a different student. It's so refreshing than Trace. And she's just like, it's such a joy, but she totally pulled her grade up to a B+. But they want her not to take an honors class next year because it's a B+, it's not an A, which to me, I'm like, okay, I'll let you have a break for a year. But still, it's like they will sit there and decide, how do the kids get the direction so they know they can get into these classes? Because it's not just the score, like you said, of the preparation. If they don't have, my daughter doesn't have a Carlos at the school, right? And one of the things I said, and I don't want to keep going back to race, but I said to this woman, she's a female who loves math. Number one, let's just say that as a girl, right? And she's a minority girl who loves math. And most girls struggle in math. I don't care if you're a Martian. I don't care what color you are. It's just something, I don't know what it is. Girls don't tend to gravitate to the math part. So why don't we encourage her? So how can we get people like you to say, hey, you need to take this class if you want to go to an Ivy League school in the future? And what age does that start? Now, that doesn't mean that she's going to go that path, but just have that preparation, just like you're preparing your 2 and 4-year-old right now to be able to walk in your shoes, how your parents set you up, right? How do I start that now? And she's going into 10th. And what advice would you give me? Because they just released something that they're going to have some college prep. Do I start now or do I wait next year in 10th grade? And she just got something from Cambridge about doing this summer program. But a family friend said put her in the Harvard summer program. It just looks good because it's not about your GPA anymore, right? It's not about her having a 4.0. Long story short, they tried to say to my daughter, well, we don't know how she's going to deal with high school. It may be too hard for her. And she's very nonchalant. So recently they had kind of an evaluation. They said, we all were concerned because she doesn't really say anything in class. She just kind of minds her own business. And she's got straight A's, except the math class. She has a B, right? And it's only because it's math, it's like these proofs, right? Which is a little challenging for her. And they were like, they had to eat their words because they were trying to discourage her from taking these honors class. She has a history honors and an English honors. Why? We don't need to do that. What advice would you give me? Because right now I need that. Like I'm going into 10th. Do I start now? And what preparation do I need to take or advice?
Yeah.
And other parents are going to want this too, because I have a 14-year-old. And believe me, the 2 and 4-year-old is good. Everyone says this, and I'd be like, yeah, it goes, it's like lightning. It goes by amazing. So fast. You look up, they're 14 with an attitude.
No, I even my nieces being in grade school, it's time flies. It goes and so, I think proofs are just tough. I mean, that's a very isolated. I mean, you don't get into them until later in calculus again. So at that point, you made the choice to go into advanced math, so that's on you. But when you find them in geometry, trying to find that side angle side and proving that a triangle is a triangle and such or Pythagorean theorem, they're just tough. It's a very tough area, and it's the first introduction to it. So many kids struggle there. I think that when we're looking at the guidance when it comes to class choice, that's actually a very very important, right? Very, very, and not extremely complicated, right? I don't think that it's a topic that is difficult to grasp, but if you don't know it, it's very difficult to fix. So if you, for example, for some of the schools that I work with, they now offer a combined algebra 2 and pre-calculus class, right? So you're taking 2 years of math in one year in a double period. A lot of them offer summer courses for Algebra 2 exactly because of that. Because sometimes, for example, let's say you get out of 8th grade and you just took Algebra 1, and then your students or your school says, no, you have to take Algebra 1 again your freshman year. For a lot of the elite schools and, STEM professions, it's important to take calculus before you enter college. And that becomes extremely difficult if you're a year behind. And so you see some of those band-aids being made in certain schools, right? Because a lot of schools don't do that. So then you have to go look for programs that they'll accept, essentially, to be able to jump a year ahead, which is really the year you should have been in the first place. And I think from an education standpoint, it's tough because you don't want kids to struggle too much. But there is, the idea that they should struggle a little bit, right? It should never just be you're breezing through, because some of that sort of problem solving and critical thinking that comes with that struggle and reorganization and et cetera is essential for future knowledge, right? And future learning. And so I think that guidance should start early on. I think 9th, 10th grade, understanding that, hey, if you want to apply to some international programs, they're going to have a requirement of pre-calculus. So if you're thinking that your senior year, you're just going to take stats, and as complicated as stats is, at the high school level, it's probably very different than the one that you thoroughly enjoyed, right? And I think that
no one needs stats. I think it should be banned. Go ahead.
I'm taking some crazy stats classes.
But she's that kid though. Like, she got a B in proofs, but academically, as far as like algebra,
you have to advocate for them, because
all that part.
Yeah, because and the thing about this too is we're talking about two things, right? One is falling behind a year in terms of the class, but then you're also talking about rigor, right? Because it's regular versus honors versus AP versus OIB versus IB versus etc., right? So there are different levels of rigor. And when you look at universities, if you ask an admissions officer, hey, what are the things that you evaluate most of them will say, number one is your GPA, right? Because that tells us how you're able to perform a class. And two is rigor. So if you go and you take regular classes versus honors classes because you're like, ooh, it's an easy A. I've had this conversation so many times. And actually with a lot of my students who don't come from elite high schools, right? And they come from more community high schools where maybe college isn't as much of a sort of given result. A lot of times they'll say, hey, just take the A. But the problem is now with GPAs reflecting rigor, right? That's why you hear kids having a 5.2, right? And what they're doing is a 4.
Right.
Yeah, right. Exactly. And Martine, yeah, that's so basically the way that this works, right? I'm just going to speak in a very general term about it, is that a 4.0 reflects a traditional like A, B, C with, A being allotted the 4.0 or whatever, right? When you start taking, and different schools do it different ways. That's why I just want to speak in general, because some have 100-point scales as well, right? Like this is what they do is they essentially will assign an extra 0.5 if it's an honors class, or they'll assign an extra 1 point if it's an AP. So if you get an A in an AP, you might get a 5.0 as opposed to a 4.0, right? Okay. And then everything's getting average, so that's how you end up getting.
Got a B, so that's not a
5. Right, and so sometimes they'll say, oh, getting a B in an AP is really just getting an A and a right. So you start getting this sort of, and all this advice is sort of very subjective, right? Because you're like, well, maybe not. It depends what class it is, how whatever. But that rigor, right? If you go and you get straight A's and you have a 4.0, that actually might not work to your favor if the kid you're competing against has a 4.5 and maybe has a couple B's but has taken all APs. And so planning from the beginning, and with freshmen taking APs, right? They take AP Human Geo, they might take AP History, they might take whatever other classes. The decision's getting pushed earlier.
My head's going to explode, Carl. So you're saying my head is going to explode.
But to sort of just big picture wise, it's the planning early on. And then also to touch on another thing that you said, the summer programs, right? It's also that becomes an issue as well, right? So just off the top of my head, you start thinking of some summer programs that are extremely selective, right? You have, I think there's a writing program in the University of Iowa, if I remember correctly, that's one of the elite writing programs, right? Where it costs basically nothing, right? Or an engineering program at Michigan. I'm just thinking of ones that my students have gone recently. Those are almost no cost because the bill is sponsored by someone else, right? Like someone else is picking up the tab. Those are the ones that are the most impactful when it comes to university admissions, at least here in the States. When you start to look at certain programs that have $12,000, $15,000, $20,000 price tags, sometimes, right, what happens there is your focus, if you're going to one of those programs, is more your networking than it is the actual academics,
Right.
because you're trying to meet people there, right? And so your focus there should be different, just because they know that it costs that much, right? So there's a lot of arguments of like what makes a quality summer program. Should you be volunteering at your local food pantry? Should you be, right? Are those things part of your summer planning as well? Maybe you go to a summer program abroad to understand how to live, right, in a dorm, and then you come back and you volunteer and you give back. That sort of summer planning so that students get a good balance is extremely important. But who tells you that?
Right. Who tells you
Right.
that?
Like who tells you like, oh yeah, by the way, there's, you want to do screenwriting. There's an amazing program, not only at USC, but also at NYU, and
Right.
it's only like 2 weeks and you should go do that. It's, or let me add even another one. Amherst has a pre-college program for diverse candidates, right, who come from disadvantaged backgrounds. If I remember, I don't know if they have it anymore, but I've had a couple students who have gone through it and who have gone to Amherst because of it. And those programs are key. They're feeders, right? They literally are like, great, we want you to come here because you've succeeded at this program. How do you find out about that if I'm in Oakland? Right? But that could literally change the course of your college application, right? And so I think that the game starts early, right? The game starts freshman, sophomore year, and by the time you wake up and it's junior year, there's a lot more limited things you can do to build your resume, to access some of the resources that, and this goes for all socioeconomic levels. I'm not talking only, this is everybody, right? My students can come to me from all different backgrounds, right? And they can have all the resources in the world, but information is everything, right? If you do not know, and then you have to apply to those programs, you need to write letters or write essays. And let's not even get to the fact that at junior year, you say, hey, make sure that this year you really take the time to talk to your teachers, because you're going to need letters of recommendation next year. And if that person writes you a generic letter of recommendation, right?
I'm already traumatized.
I'm sorry. We're going way too deep.
We're not going anywhere because I'm going to need you, because my head is going to go like this, and I'm like, all that stuff you said to me.
Carlos, Carlos, I have to tell you, I mean,
your skill set is unbelievable.
Yeah, I'm like,
where
was Carlos in my life?
Right.
It's what's crazy about it is a lot of this I've learned on the job, right, as I've grown, and it is interesting that I have no access to this whatsoever. When I was, I remember my prep was my dad giving me an SAT book and being like, here you go, good luck.
Yep.
I was like, yeah, and he was like, make sure you do what you got to do. And I was like,
yes. And then, so when the kids go to me, like, you don't know any better. Like, this is how it was in the old days. I said, excuse me, when I was a kid, my grandparents had encyclopedias. Do you even know what that is? And there was a thing called a library, because you had to go research and then spend your day there and do your papers. Like, there was no such thing, push a button and get the information. And, there's programs now that could teach you how to do some of the classes. Like, I've learned from my son, right? He's taken these like French classes, and I'm like, well, how are you getting such good grades? He took Spanish for 6 years, can't speak anything, doesn't understand anything. I understand Spanish better than him, but I realized that there were programs that he was able to pull up on the computer. So I said, you know what? See, you guys can get through, because there's actually like, you guys can basically are cheating is what I think is going on. But my daughter's not that kid, but my son is.
Hey, optimizing his efforts. It's
right. He goes, I'm not doing that. It just tells me how to do it. Well, we had to do the work. We actually, we didn't have helmets. We had to ride our bicycles, get our knees scratched, handlebars. so much more that we had to do. We were tougher kids, regardless of what they say about us. You're a little bit young, Carlos, for that, but Martine knows what I'm talking about.
I mean, I think of sort of the inspirational stories that I've heard, not only from both my parents, when they came here, they only got their doctorates here in the States. They got all the rest of the schooling in Colombia. But even my father and mother-in-laws, right? Like that they just even the stories, like my father-in-law took his ACT in a cafeteria while lunch was going on, right?
Wow.
So there is some of that skill set that goes outside of just the grit to be able to push through, right? And the skill sets that if you build those will get you far beyond one formula or one exam. And so I think that, and a lot of that is upbringing, but can we facilitate that as educators to help some students who maybe didn't get as much of those lessons instilled in them early on to help them succeed further because of it? So it's a very it's a complicated, right? Like how we did it in our day and now you have AI, right, writing essays.
Oh, really? See, I didn't even know that.
Yeah, big
chat
GPT. I mean, like it's that was a big topic of conversation in a class.
I took journalism. I wish I'd have known that.
I don't know if
in my wrist.
I don't know if you want the robot writing, but
it's not great, but
yeah, it's and it's learning. It's one of those things where as we move forward, it's, I think, curation of knowledge, right? Expertise changes to say, hey, here are all the tools that you have. Here's how you apply them. So I think, yeah.
Carlos, you've confused me because I said, Elon, bring this home. But then as we have these conversations, more stuff pops into it.
I know that we keep going on.
So let me, I'll ask you this. We'll get our few last questions and then we get to ask our fun questions at the end. I heard what common thing, and I think Elon talked about, she went to school later, and I think a lot of that goes to the resilience of her. And so how do you train people, like you said, if they don't get into the USCs or the Berkeleys, what can you impart upon people to like say, you know what, I might not have gotten to that school, but or I'm older than a traditional learner. I'm not going to trip that I didn't get into the Yales. I ended up going to a community college or Sac State or whatever. How do you keep that fire going and getting the most they can out of that education for that person? What kind of tools or what advice would you give so a person doesn't like feel less of themselves because they didn't necessarily get into a place because of, like you said, there's so many factors I didn't realize that you brought into it to play today. That's kind of scary because I didn't realize, like you said, you really do have to prep. And there's people prepping. Now I've realized there's people that Elon's child's competing against that might have started prepping when they were, 8 or 9 years old, from what you're saying. So, I mean, any advice you can give to people that would keep that fire going to go to school, regardless of what program they're in?
I think that when we consider school as a means to an end, right, and as much as being a lifelong learner is essential, right? Again, it goes back to that why. Why are you doing this, right? Why are you in this program? The school that you get into initially, right, especially now with so many careers requiring grad school, professional certifications, etc. It just, the goal is so important. Yes, the process is key, but where you're going is so important to identify early on, right? There's we see this, and Martine, this is something you and I have talked a lot about, of the cost of education, right? And not only the cost and the immediacy, but the cost that can come from loans and etc. in the future. And so it's so important to understand, okay, I really want to do this because I want to be that doctor, or I really want to help people, as a social worker, right? And that's my goal, and that's what I want to do. How do I best equip myself to get into there? And also the idea that a lot of corporations, their training programs are basically college part 2. So sometimes, understanding that getting out there into the professional world can be as valuable or more valuable than doing that extra year or two of college that you might not be able to afford. So that's why I think working on that why and really being conscientious of just loading up education is not always the solution. Many times it's not. And saying, hey, if I'm at this university doing this particular degree, and maybe it was my third choice, maybe it was my fourth choice, right? I need to be the best that I can be at this, because the skills, the habits, the things that are out beyond just the theory that you're learning in the classroom can be actually the most important things in the future, right? I didn't even go to school for business, right? I didn't go to school for education. And so, but the skills that I gained, the ability to research things that I learned in college became immensely valuable when I started my own company, a year out of university. So I do think that that sort of understanding that connecting those dots in the moment is very difficult. But you have to sort of make sure that you're portraying that spirit of excellence, right? Making sure that you're doing the best that you possibly can, and then understanding what the goals are that you're going towards. That should not be, I want to get into this elite university. That is not a goal. That is a mean. And I think that if you approach it that way, that could be, to me, I mean, to the conversations I've had, can be a very motivating line of thinking.
Well, my preparation that I think I'm doing, you've enlightened me today, because I started my daughter speaking Mandarin at an early age. I had her in viola. She hated that, but at least she had it. She had 2 years of viola. So I'm trying to get her in swimming because she's a great swimmer. But I'm like, these are all the things that you need to get the kind of school you want, because you don't want to be like the average kid who just has good grades, but we have to find something for you to volunteer. But shoot, I don't know anything after talking to you today. I'm like,
my apologies. My apologies.
No. It's so enlightening, because I don't, the resources. It's not the resources. I don't have the knowledge that I thought I had, as far as, especially, I didn't go to Ivy League school. So I need to know how to prepare her to get into those schools for that admissions part, and with my son, going back to the testing, it was more of a processing thing for him. Like, he's great at writing. He's good at math, at certain areas. It was the switching for him. So if he's doing a test, and that's another thing, if he had to spend a certain amount of time on the English, and which is, I think it's great now that you can take just specific areas, because that was a problem. It was from going from one subject to the other, or if he's doing math, going to calculus, to algebra, to division. I mean, it was like those kind of things where it would get, discombobulated. That wasn't his strong areas. It was the switching of different subjects. When he's focused on that one thing, he's great. And I have to tell him, he's with so much tutoring with, which you do, is where he's able to be independent now. I don't have to say anything or ask him. He goes to school, he's doing well, but he's had so much tutoring, which for the first time I've had to get my daughter tutoring just improves, because she's great when it comes to math. It's just that this was a challenging part for her. But just the process, we have to have more conversations, because I'm going to need help, because I realize I don't know anything. I want to thank you for letting me be a part of this, Martine, because it's really helped. And he just happened to reach out, and I'm like, okay. But
Elon's she's such a happy person. We text each other, and I'll say, hey, I'm going to have this so-and-so on. I like to make that one, Fig, or I'll do that. But and now that she's got her own podcast, we're gonna definitely have a part 2 with you, Carlos. And let me ask you this:
we definitely are.
A couple rapid fires before we go. If there's one person that you could meet in your lifetime, it could be anybody, who would it be, and what would you say?
One person I can meet in my lifetime. Honestly, I'm gonna go. I don't think it's a cop-out answer, but I think it's a valid one. So I actually never really had the opportunity to meet I met my grandfather when I was really young, but I think that his business background, right? my grandma was a teacher, right? And I kind of like, okay, got that. But I would love to have met, some of the entrepreneurs in my family from earlier generations. I have a lot of
It's a
cousins,
great
and
answer.
but
Mhm.
it's just very interesting to sort of learn more about where you come from. I think it makes you extremely, it empowers you to do more on that end.
What would the older self say to the younger self in terms of advice?
Okay, this is very very niche, but my team will understand this. So there are these lists where they're like, hey, here are all the most common mistakes that entrepreneurs make. Be careful. I would have read that list when I was young, because now I read it and I'm like, yep, that's 2011, that's 2012, and yeah, that would be the sort of, but I guess at the same time as most entrepreneurs, like unpredictability is kind of how we thrive as well. So yeah, that with a little bit of,
Okay, so guilty pleasure food wise.
I mean, man, I'm gonna put myself as like classic Chicago. I mean, like deep dish is kind of where my head's at.
Did I
A
say
little bit of
that one?
little bit of Portillo's and a nod to Key West, but some Key West key lime pie.
Yeah,
Oh, I love
Chicago.
key lime pie. So good. CPK has the best key lime pie. Do you know that?
Oh yeah. Oh, do I? Oh, do I?
Yeah,
It's so good. I can't eat it anymore, but enjoy because I love it.
and what do you want to be remembered for, Carl? This is always I always end with this question because it's probably one of the most significant questions that all of us have in our lifetime. I remember when I gave this Elon too. And what do you want to be remembered for when you're no longer here?
Honestly, I hope, I've thought about this a lot more once I had kids, right? And you start to think, other than being successful in like your businesses or whatever else, like what do you really want to leave behind? And I think that for me is just greater accessibility to education, right? And to educational knowledge, right? Because I think there's a lot of really powerful thinkers that are innovating in so many different ways. But from my standpoint, just making more of this gate kept knowledge more accessible to people like me and people like us, and I think that if we do that, it's going to improve not only minority performance, but I think overall as a society. Yeah, so
And I'm going to put this question to both of you. Yeah, Carlos, how do they get a hold of you if they want to get a hold of your services and get in contact with you? What's the best way to do that? And then Elon, after Carlos, obviously, I want to you got to give your podcast a little bit of shout out, and also Elon does writing, and she just does about everything, and so I want you to plug that as well. So, Carlos, how do they get a hold of you?
honestly, my email that I think we'll put in the description is definitely the best way to track us down. And yeah, and our website as well will be on there. The other projects I have are sort of work in progress, so they'll be coming a little bit later this year. But I'm
Carlos,
hoping that then we'll have our part two, Martine, so we can discuss.
can you give your website, your address,
Sure,
and your
sure.
email?
It's bectutoring.com. So just pretty simple. I used to have Becerra educationalconsulting.com, and I learned a little bit about the use of too many characters.
Do you have a business phone number as well?
To be honest with you, email is probably the best. So
Okay.
we, after COVID, went completely virtual. Right now that we have sort of national, international
So
presence.
what's your email? What's your email?
It's just Carlos. It's just Carlos at bectutoring.com. So
Perfect.
just
Perfect.
my first name. Yep.
Elon, you're next.
Well, it's my IG, which is always how I respond instantly, is Elon Carter P on IG. And I have a company called Trace in London Entertainment because I manage my son. Really, the one that I'm very active of is TraceAustinMusic.com. So I will respond to that because I do a little bit of everything, even though that's more entertainment driven. It is something that I'm active constantly because I'm on red carpets with him, managing him. And I'm also now on Tempting Conversations featuring Dr. Marissa, which is an NBC radio show. And it comes on after the NBC morning show on Sirius Radio. So I will be on Fridays, and I'm going to have these two lovely gentlemen, which I so enjoyed today. You guys are going to be on my podcast too.
Oh man. Okay.
So we're going to continue this conversation.
Yes, we are. And join us for the next podcast when we have more amazing guests and other hosts like Elon and amazing guests like Carlos. And we'll see you then. And thank you so much. In the meantime, keep learning. And until next time.